Welcome to SarderTV. I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Joining us today is Safi Bahcall, who comes from a rather eclectic background. He began his career as a physicist, did a stint at McKinsey as a consultant, and from there he founded a biotech company and has recently written a groundbreaking new book, which is also a bit eclectic, called LoonShots: How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. Safi, it's so great to have you here.
Thanks, very glad to be here.
So Safi, you've come from a really interesting career path. You started out in the halls of science as a physicist to the hallowed halls of corporate America as a CEO. And you had several stops in between, including a stint at McKinsey as a consultant. So tell us a bit about your career journey.
Well, I have been lucky to have a bunch of different careers, as you said. I was academic for many years, and I was actually in two very different areas of science, two very different areas of physics. Then I went into consulting, which is about solving problems, but in a very different context, in the business world rather than the science world. Then I started a company, a biotech company, focused on developing new drugs for cancer. Then I took that company public, so I was a public company CEO. So it was a bunch of very different careers, and I think what motivated me was learning. It was every time I got too comfortable, like I felt I really knew what I was doing, I tried to jump ship and do something completely different, so I would start at the beginning of the learning curve.
Did you always apply your scientific background into all of these different things you did?
Yeah, I think coming from an unusual background, especially having a pretty rigorous science background, is uncommon in the business world, right, and it can give you, there's advantages and some disadvantages. The advantage is that I think the benefit of science, or especially physics, is it helps you see through noise. Helps you understand what matters and what doesn't, what's the signal, what's the noise. And that can be very important, especially in the business world when you're just surrounded and flooded by data and have to make decisions very quickly. The disadvantage is that sometimes you lead too much with the brain.
So do you overanalyze things, you think, too much?
Well, I think if you come from a science background, you're trained to explain things logically, and here's how it works, and here's why it works. And one of the things that I had to learn, sometimes the hard way as a leader, is how to lead from the heart, not just from the brain.
Tell us about how this career journey prepared you to write your brand new book, LoonShots, and how did you come up with such a fun, unorthodox name? I love that title.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Well, LoonShots is about the intersection of physics, business, and history. It's what an idea from physics tells us about the behavior of groups and how teams, companies, and even nations can use that to innovate faster and better. And I think it's kind of only because I lived in both worlds, I was a CEO and I was a physicist, that I could write about what one area tells you about the second. I think if you've only been in business, it's pretty hard to apply principles of physics in a meaningful way. And if you're an academic, a professor at university, it's pretty hard to understand what really matters for a CEO running a business.
And what motivated you to write this type of book now at this juncture, and who's your target audience?
Well, I think when I first started off as a CEO, as a first-time CEO, I was in my early 30s, I read everything I could find. It was like drinking from a fire hose about what would it take to be a better leader, to build a great company. And so much that's out there is about culture, culture, culture. And not that it's wrong, and the first 10 times I heard about it was great, and then the next 50 times, but the 1,000th book on culture, 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 I was getting a little frustrated. I wanted something less about the squishy psychology and more about, is there a hard science of designing organizations to innovate better? And so that's what started me, and what I discovered, which was very important and I think urgent, is the focusing so much on culture. Mm-hmm. You miss aspects of structure which in many ways are easier to address, and by missing those things you can drop the ball on important new products, like we were working on drugs for cancer. If you over-focus on culture and miss structure, those important new products might never see the light of day. And that's kind of what inspired me to write this book, is to help people who have these important new ideas get them to patients or to customers.
So what do you find more complex, understanding how business works or how science can be leveraged in order to work in a business environment?
Which do I find more complicated? How to apply science in business? Or, you know, that reminds me of a story. There's a story of there's a guy who is in a house, his boiler is not working, hot water heater. He calls a mechanic. The mechanic comes over, goes to the basement, looks around the hot water heater, and after a couple minutes, points at a spot, bangs it with his fist, boom, it's fixed. 2 weeks later, the guy gets a bill for $2,000. The guy's like, are you crazy? You just like banged the thing with a fist. Could you please itemize your bill for me? This is insane. And the guy sends him an itemized bill for the banging of the fist, $5. For knowing where to bang, $1,995. So the technical aspects of applying some principles of physics or mathematics to the incentives in business was not that hard. The 20 years of understanding how and where and why to apply that, that's where all the work was.
So explain what you mean in your book when you talk about the science of phase transition, and how can companies use this to their advantage in order to remain innovative, which is a big problem for a lot of companies.
You often read about, you know, say in the covers of magazines, they talk about, you know, this incredible company that's, you know, it could be Nokia or Amazon or BlackBerry, you know, RIM, BlackBerry, and they're the models of amazing culture. And then 2 weeks later, you read about them, they're gone. Like, what happened?
Right.
And, you know, Nokia was a good example. It started as this conglomerate that was, you know, focused on manufacturing and industrial stuff, and it was famous for rubber boots and toilet papers. And within 20 years, it became the dominant smartphone company in the world. They had a far larger market share at the time than Apple does today. They were selling 50% of all the smartphones on the planet. They were the most valuable company in Europe. And then they tanked. They actually had the idea of, you know, a new kind of phone. There was a small team of engineers that had an idea for a new kind of phone, and with a big touchscreen screen and a crazy idea of like an online application store. And the same leaders that transformed the company and made it, embraced wild new ideas for 2 decades, shot down that idea. What happened? So what a phase transition is when a system suddenly changes. For example, a glass of water transforms from fluid and the molecules are sloshing around to completely rigid. Totally different behavior, but it's the same molecules inside. So we apply that to business by saying, why do these teams and companies transform from embracing wild new ideas to rigidly rejecting them? And the advantage of doing that is that once you understand that transition, you can control it. You can learn how to manage it. You can learn the science of designing more innovative teams and companies.
And that's how you founded your biotech company, by using that principle?
Well, I think it was in the course of managing my biotech company, as we grew and grew and grew, I started to see some of these changes happen. So I think every entrepreneur, manager, or leader sees that when you're small, everybody's focused on, you know, the next great idea, and they all come together on that next great idea. But as you grow larger, something changes. And it's hard to put your finger on why it changes, how it changes, and what you can do about it. So LoonShots is about the science of that, why it suddenly changes, and what you can do about it.
So how have you leveraged hard science to help solve organizational stagnation at formerly groundbreaking companies, some of which you just named, like a BlackBerry, for example?
So one of the problems that teams or companies get stuck in is they have a LoonShot. They have some great breakthrough. You know, BlackBerry had the RIM, iPhone had the iPod, Nokia had its sort of first original smartphones. Even Xerox, going way back, had the Xerox machine, which was, you know, one of the first great blockbuster products. And then that becomes a franchise.
Right.
So how can they work on the next crazy idea, but also continue to deliver on that franchise? And that's where most companies stumble. They focus actually either too much on one or the other, and they need to find the balance. So understanding kind of the science of phase transitions and why companies suddenly change can help you identify how and why you need to separate the artists working on crazy ideas from the soldiers who are delivering on the franchises, how to maintain the balance between the artists so neither one dominates the other, but you have both going at the same time. Probably most importantly, managing the transfer between the two, because that's the failure point of innovation.
So should most companies adopt like a LoonShot department, or just always have a group of people within a company that's always churning like that?
Yeah, and that's the kind of underlying idea that being good at LoonShots or being good at franchisers are two totally different things. You want the artists focused on LoonShots separated from the soldiers focused on franchises. I'll just give you an example. The English word risk. It's one word. You think it has one meaning, but it doesn't. To an artist, risk is a good thing. Imagine saying to an artist, you've really de-risked your art. There's no risk in your art. That's a horrific thing.
So boring, yes.
That's a horrific thing. But imagine going, a soldier who's manufacturing guns or manufacturing planes, you say you've really de-risked the manufacturing. That's a terrific thing. It's the same word. So if you have them all jumbled together and you use the same language, it's going to be very confusing for both. You want to separate them and then recognize that the big challenge is not about which project are they working on. If you have good artists and you have good soldiers, the big challenge is managing the transfer. They're speaking different languages. You need a translator. You need someone who goes between both worlds and moves ideas and projects back and forth. That's the only way to create kind of sustainable innovation and sustainable creativity. Deliver on your franchises, deliver on your crazy new ideas, and you can survive before a competitor comes up with something crazy and kills you.
You state in your book that it's important to listen to the suck with curiosity in order to investigate your project failures. So please elaborate on this idea. What does it exactly mean?
Well, it's hard to hear no one loves your baby. It's even harder to keep asking why. And so here's what I mean by that. If you've worked enormously hard on your idea or your project or your company, and then you're pitching investors or customers and they say thanks but no thanks, or let's say you have a partnership and the partner walks away, just listening and acknowledge, there's a lot of feedback in these management workshops that, repeat what you've just heard. Just repeating what you've heard is not going to get you anyplace. You have to not only acknowledge that it has flaws, but you really have to probe. You have to keep asking why they don't like your baby. Why is my baby ugly? And that's a very difficult thing to do. You're a mom,
Yeah.
I'm a dad. You don't want to hear somebody doesn't like your baby.
What do you mean?
You want to smack them. And when somebody rejects your product, you want to smack them. I worked years on this thing. Are you kidding? You don't want to buy it? It's awesome. But that won't get you anywhere.
Right.
You're just going to keep failing. What you need to do is keep asking why, but not defensively. You need to set us, okay, you're going to be when somebody says, I don't like your baby, you can react emotionally for a minute, set that aside and say, help me understand, was it something about about this product? Was it why? My competitor has something, is there a feature that didn't appeal to you? Just walk me through, kind of step by step. That's how you identify the small things that could turn your product from something that doesn't do well into a home run.
So you have to keep asking questions.
Keep asking why you don't like my baby.
So tell us, how can organizations and teams better structure themselves to leverage and support innovative and perhaps unhinged ideas that you discuss in your book?
Well, there are three things, and since I always have trouble remembering lists, I think of it in terms of visuals. There's an ice cube, there's a garden hoe, and there's a heart. So the first one, with the ice cube, it means separate your artists and your soldiers. You want water and ice coexisting. The artists work on the crazy new idea, the soldiers work on advancing the franchises, and you have different tools and systems and motivations for each because they're motivated by different things. So that's number one, separate your artists and soldiers. Number two, be a gardener, not a Moses. So that's the garden hoe. Be a gardener, not a Moses. Here's what I mean by that. There's this sort of myth or image out there that the great leader is like a holy Moses standing on the top of a mountain, raising his staff, anointing the chosen project, the iPod or whatever, the holy. And that's not only not what really happens, but it's also kind of a disaster. You want to be more of a gardener, managing the care and feeding of these two groups, managing the transfer between managing baby ideas come out not too early, not too late, feedback. Be a gardener, not a Moses. Number three, and this is really important because people get this so wrong. There's so much popular press out there that instills the wrong idea. Love your artists and soldiers equally. And here's what I mean by that. There's so much glorification of the crazy hero, the inventor, the genius. And just having an idea gets the ball from your goal line to your 5-yard line. Turning that idea into a product and delivering it on time, on budget, on spec to customers consistently is the other 95 yards. Those are the soldiers. And if you just focus on, if CEOs and managers just focused on glorifying the creator of the idea, it demotivates the 95% of your workforce that's getting the job done. So you need to, it's like a parent. If you have 2 children, you can't say, I love you, not you, go away. You need to love your artists and soldiers equally. So 3 things: separate your artists and soldiers, be a gardener, not a Moses, love your artists and soldiers equally.
Okay, so in your book, you apply scientific ideas into structured groups and teams in corporate America. What was your inspiration for actually merging these ideas together?
Well, I think when I first started out, I was a little frustrated with all the squishy psychology stuff. And sometimes it sounds good, and then you hear the opposite, and that sounds good too, and then you hear something totally different, and they all sort of sounded good. And I wanted to see or understand if there was a harder science to designing more innovative teams and companies. And what I realized is that this culture is the pattern of behavior you see on the surface. Structure is the design of incentives and systems underneath that can drive those patterns of behavior. Fixing culture is hard. Fixing structure can be much easier. One is like trying to push a battleship. Changing the whole culture of a giant organization is like pushing a battleship. Very difficult. Adjusting structure is like turning the rudder. It can be much easier.
So your book is based on the premise that structure in companies may matter more than culture. Can you share an example of this premise?
Sure. I'll give you an example from Uber. Do you take Uber?
No, I do Lyft.
I don't have a Lyft example. I'll give you a quick Uber example. So Uber, I had a friend who's been in many tech companies, very senior person there, and before the CEO transition a year or 2 years ago, there was this culture he described of everyone wants to be captain of their own speedboat in the technology group. They were in hypergrowth, and everyone wanted to create, the next Uber Eats or Uber Medicine or Uber delivers toilet paper or whatever, some kind of crazy Uber. And they were neglecting the base core technology, which ended up leading to a lot of problems. What happened underneath that pattern of behavior, which most people don't know about, they did have a lot of course, cultural problems with sexual harassment. What I'm talking about got much less press, which is the technology problems. Underneath that sort of everyone wants to be captain of their own speedboat culture problem was a structure. If you were rewarded, most companies you have a bonus target, and if you have a bad year, maybe you get 70%, or a really bad year, 50% of your bonus, and a really good year, you get 100% or 120, 130. At Uber, you could get 8 times. You could get millions. So what that led to was everyone was focused on finding their own little niche, shoving everybody aside and saying, this is my thing, so they neglected. So that's how the structure can drive culture. When they changed that and made more regular bonuses around team projects, the behavior improved. So that's how small changes in structure can drive patterns of behavior or culture on top.
What is the Moses trap that you discuss a lot in your book? And can you share an example of a company that fell into this particular trap, and then tell us how Steve Jobs and Apple actually escaped it?
Sure. Well, I could use the same example for both. So Steve Jobs, in his first time at Apple when he was young, and he just started it with Steve Wozniak, had this view of himself as a Moses, as this great product innovator, and he would stand on the top of the mountain and say, we're going to do this and we're not going to do that. And although that's the myth of what made him successful, that was actually a disaster. It was, in fact, what made him successful was exactly the opposite, was dropping that behavior. What happened the first time was he eventually, it kind of worked for the Apple II, and then the Apple II gradually got passed by many other PC makers, and they were trying to figure out the next thing. And he said, I want to work on this Macintosh project that's over here. Everybody else working on the franchise is sort of an idiot and a bozo, and it really demotivated them and created hostility at the company, and he was leading like a Moses. This is what matters, nothing else matters. Fast forward 12 years later, he was neglecting the soldiers and glorifying the artists. Fast forward 12 years later, he gets Johnny Ive to run product design, who created all the beautiful Apple products. That's kind of the ultimate artist. And he gets Tim Cook, who to run everything else, all the operations and getting things done on time, on budget. Tim Cook was known as the Attila the Hun of inventory at his previous job. One was an artist, one was a soldier. He led not like a Moses, but by separating his artists and soldiers, loving them equally. And when, in fact, he passed away, his successor was the soldier, not the artist. So he'd grown from...
And he changed his mindset about praising one versus the other.
Exactly. He'd grown from, oh, I'm an artist, only artists are good, soldiers are dumb, to loving his artists, soldiers equally, and leading like a gardener rather than a Moses.
So how can companies learn to nurture their loon shots and at the same time balance or rescue the franchises?
Yeah, I think that's very similar to what we've been talking about in terms of separating your artists and soldiers and avoiding the trap. The problem is that the danger is that most managers grow up as one or the other. You either rise up through the artist rank, and by artist I mean any kind of creative. It's a designer, it's an engineer, it could be a scientist, a biologist, or they grow up through the marketing or manufacturing ranks, the soldier ranks. And you tend to like your own kind. So artists who grow up and rise to the top, they tend to favor artists. Soldiers who grow up and rise to the top tend to favor soldiers. So if you want to nurture loon shots better, you do want to separate them, you want to manage the transfer between the two, but most importantly, you want to avoid the trap of just loving your own kind more. You want to love your artists and soldiers equally.
Now, isn't it also a good idea to let the two merge together and embrace their differences? Does that come into play too with startups?
Absolutely, and that's part of what the managers need to do is understand and recognize that these two groups are speaking different languages, they have different values, they have different training. You know, biologists and chemists or designers or engineers, they love the beauty of their product, the originality of the science, how friendly it is. The soldiers want to get things done on time, reduce error rates. You need to help both groups understand that they need each other. If the soldiers have no product, they have no life. They have nothing to sell. If the artists have no soldiers to get their ideas to customers, they have nothing. So you want to help them understand that they need each other and they should respect each other even though they're different.
What do you think makes teams receptive or resistant to certain ideas?
Well, I think there's a natural inclination to want to do whatever worked. So if this worked in the past, let's do more of that. If it works again, let's do more of that. And the more something works, paradoxically, the bigger your blinders get. You just keep wanting to do the same thing over and over. And what you have to do is be very mindful that you're wearing blinders. And that's kind of, just being aware of that is kind of half the battle. Once you're aware of that, you can recognize, look, I'm going to have the soldiers doing kind of the same stuff we've been doing, which is great and important to continue to generate revenue. But I'm going to have these crazy artists working on stuff that I think might never work. And that's okay. I need to relax my disbelief that this could never work. And just allow that to happen, separate those two, and then manage the transfer between them.
So how can teams and companies better structure themselves to continue to support innovation?
I think, obviously, we start with separating the artists and soldiers, loving them equally, but within your artist group, there's a handful of things that you can do to make that even more innovative. And here's what I mean by that. Politics is the enemy of innovation. What does politics mean? If you pay people by their rank in an organization, what are they going to do? They're going to stab their neighbor in the back. They're going to shoot down, if their neighbor has some idea, they're going to shoot it down. Why? They want to get the next thought up, not their neighbor. You've just created a design or a system or an incentive that encourages politics and encourages shooting down ideas. Bad for innovation. If you want to encourage innovation, you want to get all the incentives for politics out, which means, for example, take managers out of the promotion decisions. That sounds crazy. You're a manager, you have a couple people working for you. Of course you want to decide who gets promoted. No. What are they going to, if you decide who's going to get promoted, what are they going to be doing? They're going to be lobbying you all year long, trying to suck up to you and subtly stab their neighbor in the back. Now suppose there's some third party who's going to go once a year and just do interviews with everybody, clients, customers, you, colleagues, support staff, and say, who do you think? The people around know who's good and who's not. But by taking you out of the decision, they have no reason to do politics anymore. They might as well just do their job. So you want to take the manager out of promotion decisions and do whatever you can to reduce the incentives for politics. Stop paying people on rank. Celebrate results, not rank. Take politics out of the equation.
So what do you think causes successful companies to transition into the mode of killing great ideas, which you discuss a lot in your book, and how can this mindset actually be avoided?
Well, it's very natural when you grow big. It's inevitable when you grow big that you need layers. When you're a two-person company, you don't really need a layer. When you're a five-person company, okay, you need maybe one person is sort of a captain and the four people are helping out, but it doesn't matter very much. You sit around a table, figure stuff out. When you're 100 people, you can't have 99 people reporting to one person to get stuff done. It's not feasible. So you start to need, like, it is inevitable as you grow big, and it is the right answer to have layers. So you have to manage that. You want to, as soon as you have layers, you create politics. I want to get promoted. You can fight that by changing how you compensate people, changing how you motivate them. If there's one thing we've learned in 200 years is that people respond to incentives. If you say, I will only pay you more if you get promoted, they're just going to fight to get promoted. If you say, I will pay you if your project works, if your idea works, that's what they're going to do.
So what do you mean when you say that companies and team sizes react the same way as temperature transitions from liquids to solids? And can you share an example of this in the workplace?
Sure. So if you imagine a glass of water and I stick my finger in, I can slosh it around. And that behavior is always true, except as I lower the temperature. All of a sudden, as the temperature changes, boom. As it crosses 32, that behavior totally changes. It becomes completely rigid. It freezes. I can't stick my finger through that water anymore. But why? Those molecules are exactly the same. Not only that, there's no CEO molecule with a bullhorn saying, hang on guys, let me check the temperature. Oh, I think it's 33. All you guys run around and be loosey-goosey. Oh, wait a minute, it's 31. I think it's 31 degrees. Everybody line up rigidly and don't let that finger through. There's no such thing. It's an element of structure. There are two forces in molecules. There's one force that wants to make them run around, and there's one force that wants to lock them rigidly in place. They've got fancy physics name, entropy and binding energy. Doesn't matter. Two forces. The point is, as you change these elements of structure, the balance between those two changes, and all of a sudden they cross and the system snaps. And that's what happens in organizations. There are forces that incentives for politics. Oh, if you do really well, we'll promote you and you get a bigger salary. That encourages politics. And then there are forces for results. Oh, if you do great on your project, we're going to get a piece of that project. You're going to have equity in that project. And as you get really big, there's more incentives for politics and less for your project. The way you counter that is you change the incentives. You stop paying people on rank, get rid of the lobbying for promotion decisions, and just pay people on the performance of their crazy ideas, and then that's what they'll focus on.
Can you share like an example of a company that's actually embracing this type of environment?
Sure. I think one kind of example that I was surprised by as I was going around and doing the research for this book is Microsoft. And they have obviously a very successful franchise with their operating system franchise, and they want to make sure that gets to customers kind of on time, on budget, with the fewest quality issues. And then they created a crazy idea group, just work on stuff that has nothing to, that's where Xbox came from and all, a number of their crazy ideas came from. But Satya Nadella, when he took over, I know some of the people in that group, when he took over, he took one of the leaders of that group and he said, you know what? I want you to create a new group that's working on the crazy ideas that are too crazy for the crazy idea group. I want you to create a crazy idea group, a crazy squared idea group. And he separated them from the crazy idea group, which is then separated and created a balance between all of them and made sure that the incentives were aligned for each of them, which are very different. You want to reduce error rate in the franchise group, but you actually want lots of failures in the crazy idea group, because if you're not having lots of failures, you're not trying crazy enough ideas. So we separated the two groups and aligned the incentives with the goals of those two groups very carefully. I thought that was very impressive.
So explain the concept in your book that you call a magic number 150. And how does it actually affect organizational structures and behaviors? And have there ever been any exceptions to this?
Absolutely, and that's a very important point. So all phase transitions are a result of these two competing forces, because there's no molecule, a CEO molecule with a bullhorn. It's these two underlying forces that are acting. And in water, there's a magic number, 32 Fahrenheit. That's when the two forces cross. And in teams, as you get bigger, the balance between those forces shift, and roughly around the magic number 150 is when those two forces cross. That's when politics starts becoming more important than ideas. And that's when people start talking the hallway about, oh, you know, my promotion and this thing, what do I do to get promoted? Whereas when you're tiny, you know, when you're a three-person company, nobody's going around the hallway saying, when will I be promoted to this guy out of the three? Because that doesn't make any. The magic number 150 is roughly when politics starts overwhelming ideas. But the most interesting thing is by kind of applying these ideas, you can learn what controls that number, because that number is not written in stone. You add salt to water, you lower the freezing temperature. You put antifreeze in your car because you lower that freezing temperature so it stays liquid longer. There's the same thing in companies. Those are the small changes in structure you can do to raise that magic number. So instead of politics winning out whenever you cross 150, you can make that 300 or 500 or 1,000, and then you can create much bigger, more powerful, innovative teams. And that's kind of the goal and the main idea of applying these ideas to the business world.
So what are the three dynamics or conditions that have to exist in order for, say, a LoonShot idea to grow or flourish within a company?
I would say, number one, separate your artists and soldiers, design different systems and different incentives to motivate artists and soldiers because they respond differently. Number two, manage the transfer, not the technology. Focus on getting the ideas back and forth and the feedback back and forth between the two, because that's the failure point for innovation. And number three, love your artists and soldiers equally, because that's where most leaders and managers fall down. They grow up one or the other, and they have too much preference, and that creates an imbalance which can kill the company.
So did you have any specific goals in writing this book, and do you think you achieved them?
Well, for me, I would say I have two goals. One is, for those people who have these ideas that they think that can change the world, I want to give them hope. And I fortunately had a lot of feedback that people find it very uplifting, optimistic, and inspiring. So that was very satisfying. Give them hope, that understanding that just the first failure, the second failure might be a sign not to give up, but that you're on to something big. Because most people will give up at the first failure or the second failure. You know, there's all this popular stuff about fast fail and pivot. But it's the pot of gold is only comes after a series of stumbles. Because if something was easy, everybody would have done it. So one is, I hope to give those people who are pursuing some big idea that they think can change their world some tools as well as hope. And number two, I want to give those products that can change the world, whether they're drugs for treating cancer or Alzheimer's or other important products that can help people or empower people, a chance. Too many of them are buried underneath the weight of giant companies, and I want to give those companies and teams a chance to get those products out there.
So how do you think 21st century science will end up changing or alter the way that we conduct business?
I think 20th century science, especially physics, was about understanding the laws of nature at the most fundamental level. What's the science of the very small? What happens inside an atom? What happens inside a nucleus? What happens inside a proton? Or the science of the enormously large. What happens in the universe between the trillions of galaxies and in the empty space of the universe? 21st century science is, I think, is going to be about complexity. What happens when many things come together? Whether that's molecules in a glass of water, why do they suddenly change behavior? Or when many people come together, why do groups suddenly change behavior? So I think that has not been explored as much as the fundamental laws, and that has enormous potential to shape our world.
Now, do you see any new or unhinged LoonShot ideas that are on the horizon that business and science should be paying attention to? Any in your own mind?
You know, I mean, I spend more time in science and medicine, but there's some amazing I mean, in cancer, there's what was essentially a 100-year LoonShot of getting the body's immune system to fight tumors, like the body's immune system fights cold. And that was considered a crazy idea and impossible for almost 100 years. And in the last 10 years, we've kind of figured it out. We're at the beginning of a plan, but we've all of a sudden kind of unlocked the key to doing that. That was an amazing LoonShot that's just starting to pan out. Even in diabetes, which is an increasingly common problem, an epidemic, there are phenomenal new technologies on the horizon for engineering the pancreatic cells that generate insulin and implanting them in the body so that they can sense glucose and add insulin as needed. And then you can just almost cure certain forms of diabetes, not all forms of diabetes. And those are starting to go into clinical trials now. So in science as medicine, there are really just, it's an incredibly optimistic time, an incredibly exciting time to be alive, because the world is just full of these ideas that can transform how we treat people.
Well, Safi Bahcall, it was a pleasure talking with you today, and good luck with your fascinating new book, LoonShots.
Thanks
Again,
so much
one of my
for
favorite titles.
Thanks so much for having me here. It was fun.
And that's it for this edition of SarderTV. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Until next time, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for watching.